Let me tell you something that will sound completely backwards. The people who hurt you the most have absolutely no power over you. None. Zero. And the anger you feel right now, the frustration that's eating you alive when someone disrespects you, dismisses you, or attacks you, that's not coming from them. It never was. That rage burning in your chest, you're doing that to yourself. And I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, I don't understand. You're thinking about that coworker who sabotaged your project, that family member who always knows exactly what to say to destroy your peace, that stranger who cut you off in traffic and almost caused an accident. You're thinking, how dare you tell me this is my fault? But here's what I'm actually saying. You've been living in a prison, and you're holding the key. Every time someone bothers you, every time anger floods your system and hijacks your day, you're choosing, yes, choosing to hand your power to someone who doesn't deserve it, doesn't want it, and isn't even thinking about you anymore. That person who ruined your morning, they're already gone, living their life, while you're still rehearsing what you should have said, what you should have done, replaying the scene over and over like some kind of mental torture device you can't turn off. Here's the brutal truth nobody wants to face. Your anger is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's not about them. It never was. It's about the stories you're telling yourself, the beliefs you're carrying around like grenades with loose pins, the automatic reactions you've been programming into your nervous system for years without even realizing it. Every person who bothers you is just pressing a button that you installed. They're not creating your anger. They're revealing it. And that revelation, as painful as it is right now, is actually your greatest gift. Because if you install these buttons, you can remove them. If you created this suffering, you can uncreate it. Let me paint you a picture of what this costs you. It's Sunday evening, you're trying to relax, trying to prepare for the week ahead, but your mind keeps drifting back to Friday afternoon, to what your boss said in that meeting, the way they dismissed your idea in front of everyone. Your jaw is clenched, your shoulders are tight, you can feel your heart rate elevating just thinking about it. You've lost your entire weekend to this anger. You snapped at your partner yesterday over nothing. You couldn't focus on the movie you tried to watch. You woke up at 3 a.m. running through imaginary confrontations, crafting perfect responses you'll never actually deliver. This is what anger does. It doesn't hurt them. It devours you. The hidden cost of letting people bother you isn't just the moment of anger itself. It's everything that anger steals from you afterward. It's the creativity you can't access because your mind is consumed with resentment. It's the relationships you damage because you're carrying rage from one interaction into completely unrelated situations. It's the opportunities you miss because you're too busy being right instead of being effective. It's the person you could be becoming, but never will because you're stuck in an endless loop of reaction and regret. But here's the promise. You can break this pattern completely. Not through suppression, not through pretending you don't feel what you feel, and definitely not through some toxic positivity nonsense where you paste a smile over your pain. I'm talking about a fundamental rewiring of how you process other people's behavior. I'm talking about reaching a state where someone can insult you to your face and you feel nothing but compassion for how much pain they must be in to act that way. I'm talking about true freedom, the kind where you move through the world untouchable, not because you've built walls, but because you've dissolved the buttons entirely. This isn't about becoming passive or weak. This is about becoming so grounded in who you are that other people's chaos can't shake your foundation. This is about recognizing that the only person who can truly bother you is you, and learning to stop doing that to yourself. This is about transforming from someone who reacts to everything into someone who responds to what matters and releases everything else like water off a stone. By the time you finish this journey, you won't recognize the person you used to be, the one who gave their power away to anyone with a sharp tongue or a dismissive gesture. That person is dying right now, and who you're becoming is just starting to wake up.
Chapter 1. The Illusion of External Power. Here's what no one tells you about anger. It's a beautiful illusion, a magic trick your mind performs so convincingly that you've spent your entire life believing the lie. The lie says that when someone makes you angry, they're doing something to you. They're causing your pain. They're responsible for your emotional state. And this lie is so deeply embedded in our language, our culture, our entire way of thinking about emotions that you've probably never questioned it. You made me angry. They upset me. He ruined my day. Listen to that language carefully. It gives all the power to the other person. It positions you as the victim of their behavior, as if their words or actions have some mystical ability to reach inside your chest and flip a switch labeled rage. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Nobody has ever made you angry, not once in your entire life. What they did was behave in a certain way. They said words, they made gestures, they took actions. That's all they did. Everything else, all the anger, all the meaning, all the emotional devastation, that happened entirely inside your own mind. You witnessed their behavior, you ran it through your personal interpretation system, you compared it against your expectations and beliefs about how people should act, and then you created an emotional response. You did all of that. They just provided the stimulus. The response was 100% yours. Let me show you exactly how this works. Imagine you're walking down the street and someone bumps into you hard enough that you stumble. Your immediate reaction is anger. Who does this person think they are? Don't they watch where they're going? And then you turn around and see they're blind, tapping their white cane, apologizing profusely. What happens to your anger? It vanishes instantly, doesn't it? Replaced by compassion, maybe even guilt for being angry in the first place. But here's the critical question. Did the event change? Did the bump change? No. The bump was identical. Your body experienced the exact same physical sensation. The only thing that changed was your interpretation of what the bump meant. In the first scenario, you interpreted it as disrespect, carelessness, a violation of your space. In the second scenario, you interpreted it as an accident, an unavoidable mistake. Same event, completely different emotional responses. And both responses happened entirely in your mind. This is what neuroscientists call the cognitive appraisal theory of emotion. Your emotional response isn't a direct reaction to external events. It's a reaction to your interpretation of those events. Your brain is constantly running a simulation, asking questions. What does this mean? Is this a threat? Does this violate my rules about how the world should work? And based on the answers to those questions, it generates emotions. But here's the crucial part. Those questions and answers are based on your beliefs, your past experiences, your programming. Two people can experience the exact same event and have completely different emotional responses because they're running different software. Think about someone who cuts you off in traffic. One person experiences rage that lasts for the next 20 minutes. Another person barely notices. Same event, different programming. The angry person has beliefs running. People should drive courteously. This person disrespected me. My time and safety matter, and this violation demands an emotional response. The calm person has different beliefs running. People make mistakes. Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe they're rushing to an emergency. This has nothing to do with me personally. Neither interpretation is objectively true. They're both stories. But one story creates suffering, and the other creates peace. Here's where this gets really interesting. Your brain is designed to make these interpretations automatically, below the level of conscious awareness. By the time you experience the anger, your brain has already decided what the event means, has already compared it to your internal rule book, has already triggered the emotional cascade. This is why anger feels like it's being done to you, because by the time you're aware of it, the process is already complete. You don't see yourself creating the anger, you only experience the result. It's like watching a movie and believing the images are coming from the screen when actually the projector behind you is creating everything you see. But here's the part that most people miss. Just because this process is automatic doesn't mean it's unchangeable. Your brain is running programming, and programming can be rewritten. Those beliefs that generate your emotional responses, you weren't born with them. You learned them. You absorbed them from your family, your culture, your experiences. And because you learned them, you can unlearn them. You can install new programming. You can change the questions your brain asks when it encounters difficult behavior from other people. The reason this revelation is so powerful is that it completely shifts the locus of control. When you believe other people make you angry, you're powerless. Your emotional state is at the mercy of everyone you encounter. You're a puppet, and they're pulling the strings. But when you realize that you're creating your own emotional responses through your interpretations, you're no longer a puppet. You're the puppet master. You're in control, not of what other people do, but how you process what they do. And that's infinitely more powerful.
Let me give you a real-world example of what this looks like in practice. You're in a meeting, and a colleague takes credit for your idea. The old you would have experienced immediate anger. That's my idea. They stole from me. This is disrespectful and unfair. And that anger would have flooded your system with cortisol and adrenaline, impaired your decision-making, made you either aggressively confront them or silently seethe while your resentment poisoned the rest of your day. But the new you, the one who understands this principle, experiences the same event completely differently. You notice your initial impulse toward anger. You recognize it as your brain's automatic programming, and then you ask different questions. What's really happening here? This person is insecure enough that they need to take credit for others' work to feel valuable. What does that say about their internal state? How much suffering must they be experiencing to act this way? And does this event actually threaten anything real, or just my ego's story about recognition? With this new interpretation, you might still choose to address the situation, claiming your contribution is important, but you do it from a place of calm clarity, not reactive anger. You might feel compassion for this person's insecurity instead of rage at their behavior. You recognize that their action reveals their pain, not their power. And most importantly, you don't carry the weight of anger beyond the moment itself. You respond effectively and then release it completely, like water flowing around a rock. This is the fundamental shift, from seeing other people's behavior as something that happens to you, to seeing it as information about them. Their rudeness isn't about you. It's about their stress level, their pain, their unresolved trauma, their lack of emotional regulation skills. Their dismissiveness isn't a statement about your worth, it's a statement about their inability to be present and see clearly. Their aggression isn't an attack you need to defend against, it's a symptom of their inner turmoil. When you truly understand this, when you internalize it at a level deeper than intellectual agreement, other people's behavior loses its power to disturb your peace. Here's what the masters of this practice understand. You can't control what other people do, but you have complete control over the meaning you assign to what they do. And the meaning creates the emotion. Change the meaning, change the emotion. Someone insults you. Old meaning, they attacked my value as a person. New meaning, they're in pain and trying to transfer it to me. Someone dismisses your contribution. Old meaning, they don't respect me. New meaning, they're operating from scarcity and fear. Someone breaks a promise. Old meaning, they betrayed me. New meaning, they're struggling with reliability and I can choose whether to trust them again. None of this means accepting mistreatment or becoming a doormat. You can set boundaries, end relationships, protect yourself, and address problems, all without anger. In fact, you can do these things far more effectively without anger because you're operating from clarity rather than reactivity. The person who never gets angry isn't passive. They're powerful. They're so grounded in their own center that nothing external can knock them off balance. They respond to situations with precision and effectiveness because their vision isn't clouded by rage. But here's the challenge most people face when they first encounter this truth. It requires taking full responsibility for your emotional state. And responsibility feels heavy. It feels easier to blame other people for your anger, to make them responsible for your suffering. But that ease is a trap. Blame might feel good in the moment, but it's a prison. It keeps you dependent on other people changing before you can have peace. Responsibility, on the other hand, is freedom. It means you can have peace right now, regardless of what anyone else does. The price is letting go of the victim story. The reward is liberation from a lifetime of unnecessary suffering. Here's what I need you to understand before we go deeper. This isn't about positive thinking or pretending everything is fine. This is about seeing reality clearly. The reality is that your anger is internally generated through interpretation. The reality is that you can change your interpretations. The reality is that most of what you're defending when you get angry isn't your actual safety or well-being, it's your ego's story about how things should be. And those stories are negotiable. They can be rewritten. They can be dissolved entirely. And when they dissolve, what remains is an unshakable peace that nobody can touch. That's where we're going. That's what you're becoming. Someone who moves through the world like a force of nature, present, powerful, and completely undisturbed by the chaos around them.
Chapter 2. The Architecture of Reaction. Let me show you something that's happening in your body right now that you've never paid attention to. The next time someone says something that bothers you, before the anger fully forms, there's a tiny gap, a fraction of a second, where you feel a sensation in your body. Maybe it's a tightening in your chest. Maybe it's heat rising in your face. Maybe it's a clenching in your jaw or a knot forming in your stomach. That sensation appears before the thought forms, before the story begins, before you can articulate what you're angry about. That sensation is the bridge between stimulus and response. And right there, in that tiny gap, is where your entire transformation lives. Most people never notice this gap because their reaction happens so fast it feels instantaneous. Someone disrespects them and boom, they're angry. But that boom isn't actually instantaneous. It's a process, and like any process, it happens in stages. First comes the external stimulus, the words, the action, the event. Then comes the body's immediate physical response, a surge of stress hormones, an activation of your sympathetic nervous system, that sensation I just described. Then comes the thought, the interpretation, the story about what this means. And finally comes the full emotional experience of anger, along with the behavioral impulse to attack, defend, or withdraw. This all happens in less than a second, which is why it feels automatic. But automatic doesn't mean unchangeable. Here's what neuroscience has discovered about this process. The initial physical sensation, that first surge of activation in your body, is actually pre-emotional. It's just arousal, just energy. Your nervous system is saying, something significant is happening, pay attention. But that arousal doesn't become anger until your mind labels it as anger, until you attach a thought to it. And this is where everything pivots. Because if you can catch that sensation before the thought forms, before the story begins, you can redirect that energy entirely. You can let it pass through you like a wave instead of letting it crystallize into anger. But if you miss that gap, if the thought forms automatically and you identify with it, the energy locks into place and becomes the full emotional experience you call anger. Think about this carefully, because it's the most important mechanism you'll learn. That physical sensation, the tightness, the heat, the tension, isn't the enemy. It's just energy moving through your nervous system. It only becomes suffering when you resist it, when you add a story to it, when you identify it as my anger. But if you can meet that sensation with pure awareness, without judgment, without story, something remarkable happens. It peaks and then it passes. Every sensation in your body is temporary. Every wave of energy rises and falls. But your mind turns temporary sensations into permanent emotional states by feeding them with thoughts, by rehearsing the story of what happened and why it's wrong and what should have happened instead. Let me walk you through what this looks like in real time. You're at a family dinner. Your parent makes that comment they always make, the one that implies you're not living up to expectations, the one that's been triggering you for 20 years. The words hit your ears. Immediately you feel it, that familiar tightening in your solar plexus, that surge of heat, that clenching in your jaw. In your old pattern, this is where your mind instantly jumps in with thoughts. Here we go again. They never respect my choices. I'm never good enough for them. Why do they always do this? And those thoughts fuel the physical sensation, amplify it, transform it from a passing wave into a sustained state of anger. You're locked in. The rest of the dinner is ruined. You're bitter, defensive, withdrawn. You've been hijacked. But here's the new pattern. The comment happens, the sensation arises, but instead of immediately jumping to the thought, you pause. You notice the sensation with curiosity instead of judgment. You think, there's tightness in my chest. There's heat rising. Interesting. You breathe into it. You let it be there without needing to fix it or fight it or understand it. And here's what happens. The sensation peaks and starts to fade. It might take 10 seconds. It might take 30. But if you don't feed it with thoughts, it naturally dissipates. Your nervous system returns to baseline. And from that calm place, you can choose how to respond. Maybe you address the comment directly. When you say that, it feels dismissive. I'd appreciate if we could talk about my choices differently. Maybe you let it go entirely, recognizing that your parent is operating from their own fears and limitations. Either way, you're responding consciously instead of reacting unconsciously. You're in control.
This is what psychologists call affect labeling, or emotional surfing, and the research on it is stunning. Studies using fMRI scans show that when people simply name and observe their emotions without judgment, activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, decreases significantly. The very act of witnessing the sensation and noting it, I'm noticing anger arising, creates enough space between you and the emotion that it loses its grip. You're no longer identified with the anger, you're the awareness observing the anger. And that shift in perspective is everything. But here's where most people get stuck. They try to suppress the sensation instead of observing it. They feel the tightness in their chest and they tell themselves, don't be angry, this shouldn't bother you, just let it go. And that doesn't work. That's resistance, not awareness. What you resist persists. When you try to push the sensation away, you're actually fighting with it, which creates more tension, more stress, more suffering. It's like trying to force yourself to fall asleep. The effort itself keeps you awake. What works is the opposite of effort. It's relaxing into the sensation. It's saying, okay, there's tightness here. I'll let it be here. I don't need to make it go away. I'll just feel it fully. And paradoxically, when you stop fighting it, it releases. Think of your emotional reactions as weather patterns moving through the sky of your awareness. Clouds form, rain falls, storms blow through, but the sky itself is never damaged by the weather. The sky doesn't resist the storm, it allows it to pass through. You are the sky, not the weather. The anger, the frustration, the hurt, these are weather patterns. They're temporary, they move through. But you've been identifying as the weather instead of the sky, believing that you are your emotions instead of the awareness in which emotions appear. Here's a practice that rewires this at the deepest level. For the next week, every time you feel bothered by someone, I want you to do this. Stop. Don't react. Don't speak. Don't even think about what happened. Just put your attention entirely on the physical sensation in your body. Where do you feel it? What does it feel like exactly? Is it hot or cold? Tight or loose? Moving or static? Describe it to yourself with precision, like you're a scientist observing a phenomenon. There's a band of pressure across my chest. It's pulsing slightly. There's warmth spreading up into my throat. Just observe. Just feel. Do this for 30 seconds or until the sensation shifts or fades. What you'll discover when you do this practice is stunning. Most of the angers you've been calling unbearable are actually completely manageable when you stop fighting them. The sensation itself isn't the problem. Your resistance to it is the problem. Your story about it is the problem. The raw sensation met with pure awareness is just energy. And energy moves. It doesn't stay locked in place unless you lock it there with your thoughts. This practice also reveals something else crucial. Many of your anger reactions are actually old, unprocessed emotions from the past being triggered in the present. That family member doesn't just make you angry in this moment, They trigger the accumulated anger of 1,000 previous moments when you felt dismissed, when you felt not good enough, when you felt powerless. Your reaction in this moment is carrying the weight of all those past moments. This is why your response often feels disproportionate to what actually happened. Someone makes a small comment and you feel rage. That's not about the comment. That's about the backlog of unprocessed emotion that comment just tapped into. But here's the beautiful part. Every time you meet these sensations with awareness instead of reaction, you're processing and releasing some of that backlog. You're completing the emotional cycle that got stuck years ago. You're healing the past in the present. Over time, as you do this again and again, you'll notice that the same triggers that used to set you off barely register. The charge has been released. The button has been removed. Not through suppression, not through willpower, but through conscious completion of the emotional energy that was trapped in your system. The masters of emotional regulation understand something profound. You don't overcome anger by fighting it. You transcend it by understanding its architecture and no longer participating in the patterns that create it. You stop feeding the fire. You stop telling the stories that sustain the emotion. You stop identifying with the reaction. And when you stop doing those things, anger loses its fuel. What remains is just sensation, moving through and moving on, leaving you clear and calm and ready to respond to life with wisdom instead of reactivity. Here's what's happening to you as you integrate this. You're developing what neuroscientists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own mental and emotional processes while they're happening. You're creating a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap lives your freedom. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, said it perfectly. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. You're building that space. You're reclaiming that power. And with every instance where you pause, observe, and choose, instead of automatically react, you're becoming someone fundamentally different. Someone who cannot be bothered. Not because nothing touches you, but because you've learned to let everything move through you without resistance. That's the next level. And you're already there.
Chapter 3. The Stories That Imprison Us. You need to understand something about the human mind that will probably disturb you. At least 80% of what bothers you isn't actually happening right now. It's not the present moment that's destroying your peace. It's the stories you're telling yourself about the present moment. And those stories, the narratives running on repeat in your head like some kind of horror film, are almost entirely fictional. They're interpretations presented as facts. They're assumptions disguised as truth. They're your mind's desperate attempt to make sense of reality by filling in gaps with imagination and then treating that imagination as if it's real. Let me show you exactly how this works. Your boss walks past you in the hallway without saying hello. That's the fact. That's what actually happened. A human being walked past another human being without verbal acknowledgement. But watch what your mind does with that fact. Within seconds, you've constructed an entire narrative. They're upset with me. I must have done something wrong. Maybe it's that report I submitted yesterday. They probably think I'm incompetent. I'm going to get fired. I'll lose my apartment. My life is falling apart. You're now experiencing genuine emotional distress, anxiety, anger, fear, based on a story you completely invented. Your boss might have been lost in thought about a sick parent. They might not even have seen you. They might have been rushing to a meeting. But your mind didn't wait for actual information. It filled the void with catastrophe and treated it as reality. This is what psychologists call confabulation, and your brain does it constantly. It takes incomplete information and creates a complete story, because incomplete information creates uncertainty, and uncertainty feels dangerous. Your brain evolved in an environment where uncertainty often meant death. A rustling in the bushes could be wind, or it could be a predator.
The humans who survived were the ones who assumed predator and prepared for the worst. So your brain is wired to fill in gaps with threat assessment, to create stories that help you prepare for danger. This was adaptive when you lived in the wilderness. It's maladaptive now, in a world where most of the threats are social and imaginary. But here's where it gets even more insidious. Your mind doesn't just create these stories. It searches for evidence to confirm them. This is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful cognitive distortions you'll ever encounter. Once your mind has decided on a narrative, my boss is unhappy with me, it will find every piece of evidence that supports that narrative and ignore everything that contradicts it. Your boss didn't smile as much in this morning's meeting. Confirmation. They sent a short email instead of a detailed one. Confirmation. They gave constructive feedback on your project. They're building a case to fire you. Confirmation. Meanwhile, your mind completely ignores the fact that they approved your vacation request, complimented your work last week, and have shown no actual signs of displeasure. Those facts don't fit the story, so they're invisible. This is why two people can go through the exact same experience and come away with completely different interpretations. You have a conversation with a friend who seems distracted. Your mind creates a story. They don't value our friendship. They're pulling away from me. I'm not important to them. Someone else in the exact same situation creates a different story. They seem stressed about something. I wonder what's going on in their life. Maybe I should check in and see if they need support. Same facts, completely different narratives. And each narrative creates a completely different emotional reality. One person is hurt and angry. The other is concerned and compassionate. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in the story they told about what happened. Here's what you need to see clearly. The story is not the truth. The story is your interpretation of limited information, filtered through your past experiences, your fears, your insecurities, your beliefs about how the world works and how people should behave. And most of the time, you're not even aware you're telling a story. You think you're observing reality. You think you're seeing what's actually there, but you're not. You're seeing your story about what's there. And as long as you believe the story is reality, you're trapped in it. You'll react to your imagination as if it's fact. You'll defend interpretations as if they're truth. You'll suffer over narratives that exist nowhere except in your own mind. Let me give you a real example from my own life that illustrates this perfectly. Years ago, I sent a lengthy, vulnerable email to a mentor I deeply respected. I was asking for guidance on a difficult decision. Days passed without a response. Then a week, then 2 weeks, and my mind went into story creation overdrive. They think my question is stupid. They've lost respect for me. They're regretting ever mentoring me. They're probably laughing about this email with their colleagues. I've embarrassed myself. The relationship is over. I was experiencing genuine pain over this story. I was rehearsing confrontations. I was considering sending a follow-up email apologizing for bothering them. And then, 3 weeks later, I got a response. They'd been dealing with a family emergency. Their parent had been hospitalized, and they hadn't been checking email at all. They responded with thoughtful, caring advice and apologized for the delay. Every single piece of my narrative was fiction. Every ounce of suffering I experienced was self-inflicted, based on a story I created and then believed without question. This happens to you every single day. Someone doesn't text you back immediately, and you create a story about what that means. A colleague doesn't laugh at your joke, and you create a story about how they perceive you. Your partner seems quiet, and you create a story about the state of your relationship. And each story generates emotions that feel completely real, completely justified, completely tied to external events. But they're not. They're tied to your interpretation of external events. And interpretations can be questioned. They can be examined. They can be released. Here's the practice that changes everything. Every time you notice yourself getting bothered by someone, pause and ask yourself this question. What story am I telling myself about this situation? Not what happened, but what story am I telling about what happened? Write it down if you can. Get it out of your head and onto paper where you can see it clearly. And then ask a follow-up question. Is this story definitely true, or is it one possible interpretation? Almost always you'll discover it's an interpretation. It's one way of explaining the facts, but not the only way. And once you see that, once you realize you're reacting to a story rather than to reality, the story loses its power. Then you can ask the most liberating question of all. What's another way to interpret this situation? This isn't about being naive or making excuses for bad behavior. This is about recognizing that you don't have complete information, and in the absence of complete information, you have a choice about what story you tell. You can tell the story that makes you the victim and the other person the villain. Or you can tell a story that's more generous, more curious, more open to multiple possibilities. And here's the crucial part. The generous story is almost always closer to the truth than the catastrophic one. Because most people are not thinking about you as much as you think they are. And most behavior is driven by internal struggles rather than malicious intent. Your coworker didn't say good morning. Maybe they're dealing with insomnia and barely functioning. Your friend canceled plans. Maybe they're depressed and struggling to leave the house. Your partner seems distant. Maybe they're processing something difficult and don't have the words for it yet. These interpretations aren't excuses, they're possibilities. They're recognition that other people are complex human beings with internal lives you can't see, fighting battles you know nothing about. And when you approach situations with that recognition, with that curiosity instead of certainty, you create space for understanding instead of anger. But here's what most people resist about this practice. It requires humility. It requires admitting that you don't know what's really going on inside someone else's head. It requires giving up the false sense of control that comes from thinking you can read minds and predict intentions. It requires accepting uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. Your mind would rather be certain and wrong than uncertain and open. But certainty without evidence is just rigidity. It's imprisonment in your own assumptions. And every moment you spend imprisoned there is a moment you're not actually living in reality. You're living in a simulation your mind created, reacting to shadows instead of to what's actually in front of you. Here's a practice that will train you to see your stories more clearly. For one full day, every time you interact with someone, consciously separate facts from interpretation. Facts. My partner came home and went straight to the bedroom without greeting me. Interpretation. They're angry at me. Facts. My manager asked to schedule a meeting for tomorrow. Interpretation. I'm in trouble. Just practice noticing the difference. You don't have to change anything yet. Just notice how rarely you're actually operating on facts and how constantly you're operating on interpretation. Notice how much of your emotional life is spent reacting to stories rather than to events. What you'll discover when you do this is both disturbing and liberating. Disturbing because you'll realize how much unnecessary suffering you've been creating through storytelling. Liberating because you'll realize that if you created the suffering through your stories, you can end the suffering by changing your stories. You're not at the mercy of other people's behavior. You're at the mercy of your interpretation of their behavior. And interpretation is flexible. It's negotiable. It's optional. The masters of this practice develop what Buddhists call don't know mind. They train themselves to rest in uncertainty instead of rushing to conclusions. When something happens that could be interpreted negatively, they pause. They acknowledge that they don't know what's really happening. They hold multiple possibilities simultaneously instead of collapsing into one story. And from that open, curious state, they wait for more information before deciding what something means. They don't suffer over imagination. They respond to what's actually in front of them. And what's actually in front of them is almost never as catastrophic as the stories their mind wants to tell. This doesn't mean you become naive or ignore patterns. If someone consistently treats you poorly, that's data. If someone repeatedly breaks promises, that's information worth acting on. But you act on patterns of behavior, not on individual interpretations of isolated incidents. You respond to what actually happens, not to what you imagine might be happening.
And that distinction is the difference between wisdom and paranoia, between clarity and confusion, between peace and perpetual disturbance. What's happening as you integrate this understanding is you're dismantling the story-making machine that's been creating most of your suffering. You're learning to see thoughts as thoughts, not as truth. You're developing the capacity to hold your interpretations lightly, to question them, to recognize them as one possible lens among many. And as that capacity grows, you become fundamentally unbotherable. Not because nothing happens, not because people don't behave in difficult ways, but because you're no longer adding layers of suffering on top of what's actually occurring. You're dealing with reality, not with your catastrophic imagination about reality. And reality, without the stories, is almost always manageable. It's the stories that make it unbearable. Drop the stories, and what remains is just the present moment, asking for a response. And you're more than capable of responding when you're not drowning in fiction.
Let me tell you about the part of you that gets angry, the part that feels bothered, the part that needs to defend and attack and prove and protect. This part has a name. Psychologists call it the ego. And the ego is not your enemy, but understanding how it operates is absolutely critical if you want to stop being controlled by other people's behavior. Because here's what nobody tells you. Almost every time you feel bothered by someone, it's not actually you being threatened. It's your ego. And your ego is a fiction. It's a story you've been telling yourself for so long that you've mistaken it for your identity. Your ego is the collection of beliefs you hold about who you are. It's your self-concept, your self-image, the mental model you've constructed of yourself. I am a competent person. I am respected. I am successful. I am a good parent. I am intelligent. I deserve to be treated with courtesy. These aren't just neutral observations. They're claims your ego is constantly trying to prove and protect. And every time someone's behavior contradicts one of these claims, your ego experiences it as a threat. Not a threat to your physical safety, a threat to your identity. And your brain treats threats to identity almost as seriously as threats to survival. Watch what happens when someone questions your competence at work. If you were just a consciousness observing reality, you'd think, this person has a different opinion about my skills. Interesting. I'll consider whether their feedback has merit. But that's not what happens. What happens is your ego jumps in and says, wait, I am competent. That's a core part of who I am. This person is challenging my identity. This is a threat. I need to defend myself, to prove them wrong, to reestablish my competence in their eyes and in my own mind. And suddenly you're angry, defensive, agitated, not because anything real has been threatened, but because a story you tell yourself about yourself has been questioned. This is the ego's primary function, to maintain a consistent, positive self-image. And it does this through a defense system so sophisticated that you're usually not aware it's operating. When someone compliments you, your ego accepts the information easily. It confirms the positive self-image. When someone criticizes you, your ego has several options. It can reject the information entirely. They're wrong. They don't understand. It can attack the source. They're just jealous. They have ulterior motives. It can deflect. They do the same thing. They have no room to talk. Or it can rationalize. I had good reasons for acting that way. The circumstances were exceptional. What the ego almost never does is simply accept criticism without resistance. Because accepting criticism means admitting the self-image is incomplete or incorrect, and that feels like death to the ego. Here's what you need to understand. The ego isn't actually trying to protect you. It's trying to protect itself. It's trying to maintain its story about who you are. And it will sacrifice your peace, your relationships, your growth, and your well-being to defend that story. Think about the last time you got into an argument where you knew, somewhere deep down, that you were probably wrong, but you couldn't admit it. You kept arguing, kept defending your position, kept escalating the conflict, not because you cared about the issue itself, but because admitting you were wrong felt like losing,
like diminishment, like a threat to your identity as someone who's right, who's smart, who doesn't make mistakes. That was your ego, sacrificing your relationship and your peace to protect a story. The ego is also what's operating when you replay conversations in your mind, crafting the perfect comeback you didn't say in the moment. What's that about? It's your ego trying to rewrite history so that you emerge victorious, so that your self-image as clever or dominant or right is preserved. The actual conversation is over. The other person isn't even thinking about it anymore. But your ego can't let it go because the ego can't tolerate the feeling that someone got the better of you, that your identity was challenged and you didn't adequately defend it. So you mentally rehearse victory scenarios over and over in a desperate attempt to soothe the ego's wounded pride. But here's the revelation that changes everything. You are not your ego. The ego is a construct, a mental formation, a collection of thoughts about who you are. But those thoughts aren't you any more than thoughts about a tree are the tree itself. You are the awareness in which the ego appears. You are the consciousness that can observe the ego's reactions without being controlled by them. And when you realize this, when you experientially understand that you are not the story of yourself, the ego's grip begins to loosen.
Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Someone disrespects you publicly. Your ego immediately activates. I am someone who deserves respect. This person violated that. I need to reestablish my status, to put them in their place, to ensure everyone knows I will not tolerate disrespect. And if you're identified with your ego, if you believe you are that story, you're compelled to act on those impulses. You attack back. You defend yourself aggressively. You make the situation worse in service of the ego's need to protect its image. But if you're not identified with your ego, if you can observe it as a mental pattern rather than as the truth of who you are, something different becomes possible. You notice the ego's reaction. Interesting, my ego feels threatened. It wants to fight back. And from that place of observation, you can choose a different response. Maybe you address the disrespect calmly and directly. Maybe you recognize that this person's behavior reflects their issues, not your value, and you don't engage at all. Either way, you're responding consciously instead of being controlled by the ego's automatic defense mechanisms. This is what spiritual teachers mean when they talk about ego death or transcending the ego. They don't mean the ego disappears entirely. They mean you stop being identified with it. You stop believing that you are the story. You recognize the ego as a tool, a social construct that helps you navigate the world, but not as your essential nature. And when you stop being identified with it, you stop being controlled by its need to defend itself. Someone questions your intelligence. If you're identified with ego, that's a crisis. If you're not, it's just information. Maybe they're right and you can learn something. Maybe they're wrong and it doesn't matter because your worth isn't determined by their opinion. Either way, no suffering is necessary. Here's a practice that reveals the ego's operations and loosens its grip. For the next week, every time you feel defensive, pause and ask yourself, what story about myself is being threatened right now? Be specific. My story that I'm always right. My story that I'm more knowledgeable than others. My story that I'm a victim of unfair circumstances. My story that I'm a good person who would never behave badly. Just identify the story. You don't have to give it up or fight with it. Just see it clearly. See that what's being threatened isn't your actual existence, your actual safety, your actual well-being. What's being threatened is a story, a claim, a belief about yourself. And stories can be questioned, they can be edited, they can be released entirely. What most people discover when they do this practice is stunning. The same stories get threatened over and over. For some people, it's always, I am competent. For others, it's, I am in control. For others, it's, I am respected, or I am superior, or I am a victim of unfair circumstances.
The ego has core narratives it's most invested in protecting, and almost all of your emotional reactivity traces back to those narratives being challenged. Once you see your core narratives clearly, you can start to question whether they're even serving you. Do you actually need to be right all the time to be okay? Do you actually need to be in control to be safe? Do you actually need everyone's respect to have worth? The answer is no, but the ego will fight to convince you the answer is yes, because without those stories to protect, the ego has no function.
Here's the deeper truth that the ego doesn't want you to know. Your actual nature, the consciousness beneath the stories, is already complete. It doesn't need to be defended because it can't be threatened. Your awareness, the part of you that observes all experiences, was never diminished by an insult and was never enhanced by a compliment. It simply is. It's the constant background of all experience, unchanged by the content of experience. When someone insults you, your awareness notices the words, notices the ego's reaction, notices the physical sensations, but the awareness itself remains untouched. It's like a mirror that reflects everything, but is stained by nothing. You can reflect an ugly image in a mirror, but the mirror itself doesn't become ugly. It remains pure, clear, unchanged. This is who you actually are, not the ego's story, not the self-image that needs constant maintenance and protection. You are the awareness that witnesses all of it. And when you start to identify as awareness rather than as ego, other people's behavior literally cannot bother you in the same way. They can say words, those words can trigger ego reactions, but you're not the ego. You're the space in which the ego appears. You're the witness of the reaction, not the reaction itself. And from that place, you can let the ego's defensiveness arise and pass without acting on it, without believing it, without suffering over it. But here's what this requires: a willingness to question your most fundamental beliefs about who you are. The ego fights this process because it's fighting for its survival. If you're not your accomplishments, your social status, your intelligence, your moral superiority, if you're not any of the stories you've been telling, then what are you? And that question terrifies the ego. It creates a kind of existential vertigo. But on the other side of that vertigo is the most profound freedom you'll ever experience. Because when you're no longer defending a story, you're no longer at the mercy of anyone who challenges that story. You're free. Not free from experiencing ego reactions, those might still arise, but free from being controlled by them. Free to observe them, understand them, and choose your response from a place of clarity rather than compulsion. The masters of this path have learned to hold their self-concept so lightly that it's essentially transparent. They're not constantly asking, what does this say about me? How does this affect my image? Do people respect me? Am I maintaining my status? They're just present, responding to what's in front of them, unconcerned with the ego's endless campaign to prove and protect. And because they're unconcerned, they're unshakable. You can criticize them, and they'll consider whether the criticism has merit. You can disrespect them, and they'll recognize it as your issue, not theirs. You can attack them, and they'll respond with whatever action is appropriate without the additional layer of emotional reactivity that comes from ego defense. They've transcended the need to maintain an image. And in transcending that need, they've become genuinely powerful. Not powerful in the ego sense, dominating, controlling, superior. Powerful in the deepest sense, grounded, clear, free. That's what you're becoming. Someone who can observe their ego's reactions without being imprisoned by them. Someone who knows who they are beneath the stories. Someone who cannot be bothered because there's nothing left to defend. There's a version of you that has never been angry, never been hurt, never been bothered by anyone. This version isn't something you need to create or achieve. It's already here, already active, already present in every moment of your life. You've just never noticed it because you've been too busy identifying with everything else.
This is what ancient wisdom traditions call the witness, the observer, pure awareness itself. And learning to rest in this dimension of yourself is the single most powerful transformation you can make in your relationship with anger and disturbance. Right now, as you're listening to these words, notice that there's something in you that's aware of the listening. There's the sound of these words, and then there's the awareness of the sound. There's the thoughts arising in response to what you're hearing, and then there's the awareness of those thoughts. This awareness isn't thinking. It's not analyzing or judging. It's simply witnessing everything that's happening. It's the background of all experience, the silent observer that's always present but almost never acknowledged. And here's what's revolutionary about this awareness. It doesn't get angry. It can't be bothered. It simply observes what arises without resistance, without attachment, without identification. Think about a moment when you were deeply angry at someone. In that moment, you were completely identified with the anger. You were the anger. I am furious. But even in that moment of complete identification, there was something in you that knew you were angry. There was awareness of the anger. And that awareness wasn't angry. It was just witnessing the state of anger. If the awareness was also angry, what would be aware of that? There would need to be another layer of awareness, and then another, infinitely. But that's not how it works. There's just one awareness, and it witnesses everything, including anger, without becoming any of it. This is the key distinction most people never make. You are not your emotions. You are not your thoughts. You are not even your sense of self. You are the awareness in which all of these things appear. Emotions arise in you like waves arise in the ocean. But the ocean isn't the wave. The ocean is the vast body of water in which waves form and dissolve. You are the ocean, not the wave. And when you learn to identify as the ocean instead of as the waves stop controlling you. They can rise and fall, appear and disappear, but your fundamental nature remains unchanged. Let me show you how to access this witness consciousness directly. Right now, wherever you are, take a moment to notice 3 sounds around you. Don't think about them, don't label them, just hear them. The hum of electronics, the distant traffic, the sound of your own breathing. Notice that you can be aware of multiple sounds simultaneously. Now notice this. Who is aware of the sounds? Where is this awareness located? Try to find it. Try to pinpoint where the witness is. You can't, can you? Because awareness isn't located anywhere. It's not a thing you can point to. It's the space in which all things appear. It has no boundaries, no center, no periphery. It's just here, always here, witnessing everything. Now apply this same observation to your thoughts. Notice that thoughts are arising. Maybe thoughts about what you're hearing right now, maybe thoughts about something you need to do later, maybe judgments about this practice itself. Notice that these thoughts appear in your awareness just like sounds do. They arise, they exist for a moment, they dissolve. And there's something observing this entire process. That observer is not thinking the thoughts, it's watching them arise. And here's the crucial insight. If you can observe your thoughts, you cannot be your thoughts. The observer and the observed are not the same thing. You are the observer, not the observed. This seems simple, almost too simple to be transformative. But when you actually practice this, when you learn to rest in observer consciousness instead of being lost in the content of experience, everything changes. Because the observer can witness anger without becoming angry. It can witness the ego's defensiveness without being defensive. It can watch stories arise without believing them. It sees all of this mental and emotional activity as just that, activity. Phenomena appearing and disappearing in the field of awareness. No more inherently real or significant than clouds passing across the sky. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone says something that would normally trigger you. Maybe they criticize your work. Maybe they dismiss your opinion.
Maybe they're rude to you for no apparent reason. In your old pattern, you would immediately identify with the reaction. The thought arises, that was disrespectful. The emotion arises, anger. And you become those thoughts and emotions. You are the one being disrespected, you are the one who's angry, and you act from that identification. But in witness consciousness, the same triggering event happens and you observe the entire process from a different position. You notice there was a critical statement made. A thought arose, that was disrespectful. A sensation appeared in the body, tightness in the chest. An emotion labeled anger is forming. You see all of this, but you're not identified with any of it. You're the awareness witnessing the whole chain of reaction.
And from that position of awareness, you have freedom. You can let the thoughts and emotions arise and pass without acting on them. You can recognize that they're automatic patterns, conditioned responses, old programming running its course. But they're not you. They're phenomena appearing in your awareness. And awareness doesn't need to act on every phenomenon that appears in it. You don't act on every thought you have. A thought can arise, I should jump off this bridge, and you don't do it because you recognize it's just a thought, not a command. The same is true for emotional impulses. The anger can arise, the desire to attack back can appear, but you don't have to act on it because you see it clearly as an impulse, not as reality, not as who you are. This is what the Buddhist concept of non-attachment actually means. It doesn't mean you stop caring or stop feeling. It means you stop identifying with the feelings. You stop believing that you are what you feel. The feeling is a weather pattern moving through. You are the sky. The weather doesn't define the sky, doesn't control the sky, doesn't damage the sky. And when you rest in yourself as sky rather than as weather, nothing that arises can truly disturb you. It can appear, you can witness it, and then it passes. That's the natural cycle when you don't feed it with identification and resistance. Here's a formal practice that trains this capacity. Set aside 10 minutes. Sit comfortably, close your eyes if you like. For these 10 minutes, your only job is to observe. Observe thoughts arising and dissolving. Observe physical sensations, the pressure of your body on the chair, the temperature of the air, any areas of tension or relaxation. Observe sounds appearing and disappearing. Observe emotions if they arise. Maybe boredom with this practice, maybe curiosity, maybe impatience. Just observe everything as if you're a scientist studying your own experience. And every time you notice you've gotten lost in thought, that you've been thinking instead of observing, gently return to the observer position. Notice, I was lost in thought, now I'm aware again. That noticing, that return to awareness is the practice. You'll get lost 100 times. That's not failure, that's the practice. Each time you notice you've been lost and return to observing, you're strengthening your capacity to rest in witness consciousness. Do this daily for a week, and something remarkable starts to happen. You begin to notice gaps, moments in daily life where you spontaneously drop into observer consciousness without trying. You're in a conversation, and suddenly you're aware that you're observing the conversation instead of being completely absorbed in it. You're angry about something, and suddenly you notice, oh, I'm watching myself be angry right now. These gaps are windows into freedom, and the more you practice formal observation, the more these gaps appear spontaneously in the midst of ordinary life. What you're doing through this practice is loosening the identification with the content of consciousness and strengthening identification with consciousness itself. You're shifting from being the character in the movie to being the screen on which the movie plays. The movie can show anything, comedy, tragedy, horror, romance, but the screen is never damaged by what it displays. It remains pure, clear, unchanged. That screen is what you actually are.
And the more you recognize yourself as the screen, the less power the movie has to disturb you. But here's what most people encounter when they start this practice. The mind rebels. The ego says, this is too passive. If I just observe and don't react, people will walk all over me. I'll become a doormat. I need my anger to protect myself. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding. Witness consciousness doesn't make you passive, it makes you effective. When you're identified with anger, you're reactive. You're controlled by impulse. You act in ways you later regret because you weren't choosing your response, the anger was choosing it for you. But when you're in witness consciousness, you see the anger, you see the situation clearly, and you choose the most effective response. Maybe that's confronting the person directly, but calmly. Maybe that's setting a firm boundary. Maybe that's recognizing the situation isn't worth your energy and walking away. Any of those could be the right choice. The difference is that you're making the choice from clarity rather than from reactivity. The masters of this practice develop what looks like supernatural equanimity to outside observers. People can insult them, attack them, try to provoke them, and they remain completely unmoved. Not because they've suppressed their reactions, not because they've built a protective wall, but because they're resting in a dimension of themselves that cannot be touched by external events. They've realized that they're not the body is something they're aware of. They're not the mind is something they're aware of. They're not their history, their personality, their roles, their reputation. All of those things appear in awareness. They are the awareness itself. And awareness has no buttons to push. It has no vulnerabilities. It simply witnesses everything with perfect equanimity. This doesn't happen overnight. You don't meditate for 10 minutes and suddenly achieve permanent witness consciousness. This is a deepening practice that unfolds over time. But even in the beginning, even in your first attempts to observe rather than identify, you'll taste freedom. You'll have moments where someone does something that would normally ruin your day, and you notice yourself just watching the reaction arise and pass without getting swept away by it. And in those moments, you'll understand viscerally what's possible. You'll know that you don't have to be controlled by your reactions. You'll know that there's a part of you that's already free, already untouchable, already at peace. And knowing that changes everything. What you're doing as you develop this capacity is creating what psychologists call psychological distance or decentering. You're learning to step back from the immediate experience and observe it from a slight remove. And research shows that this simple shift has profound effects. People who practice observer consciousness show decreased activation in the amygdala during emotional challenges. They show increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function and wise decision-making. They report lower levels of anxiety and depression. They demonstrate better emotional regulation and more satisfying relationships, all from learning to observe rather than identify. But the benefits go far deeper than what research can measure. When you rest in witness consciousness, you begin to touch something that words can barely describe. You begin to experience your own nature as awareness itself, boundless, timeless, unchanging. And that experience is inherently peaceful. Not peaceful because everything in your life is going well, peaceful because you found a dimension of yourself that isn't touched by whether things are going well or poorly. A dimension that's equally present in pleasure and pain, success and failure, praise and criticism. A dimension that's just here, witnessing everything, disturbed by nothing. That dimension is your true home. And learning to rest there is the end of being bothered by anyone because there's nothing left in you that can be bothered. There's just awareness, vast and open, witnessing the dance of life without needing it to be anything other than what it is.
Love what you're hearing? Hit that subscribe button and join our community of audiobook lovers. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories. Chapter 6. Compassion as Armor.
Here's something that will sound paradoxical. The most powerful defense against being bothered by difficult people is not building walls. It's opening your heart, not to be wounded by them, but to see them so clearly that their behavior loses its power to hurt you. This is the practice of compassion, and it's radically misunderstood in our culture. Most people think compassion means being soft, being a pushover, accepting mistreatment with a gentle smile. That's not compassion. That's doormat consciousness. Real compassion is something entirely different. It's a fierce, clear-seeing love that recognizes suffering in others and refuses to participate in the cycle of harm. And when you learn to access genuine compassion in the face of difficult behavior, you become genuinely untouchable. Let me show you what I mean. Think about someone who bothers you regularly. Maybe it's a family member who criticizes you constantly, a coworker who takes credit for your work, a neighbor who's perpetually hostile. When you think about this person, you probably see them as the problem, as someone who's doing something to you. But now I want you to consider a different perspective. This person is suffering. Whatever difficult behavior they're displaying, it's a symptom of their suffering. People who are genuinely at peace don't attack others. People who are truly content don't need to put others down. People who are deeply secure don't need to steal credit or control situations. Every difficult behavior you encounter is someone's pain leaking out onto the world around them. Your critical family member, they're probably haunted by their own sense of inadequacy, projecting their self-judgment onto you because they never learned to be at peace with themselves. Your credit-stealing coworker, they're likely driven by such deep insecurity about their worth that they need constant external validation just to feel okay. Your hostile neighbor, they're probably carrying decades of unprocessed pain, anger, and disappointment, and you've become a convenient target for what they can't face in themselves. This doesn't excuse their behavior. This doesn't mean you should tolerate mistreatment, but it contextualizes it. It reveals the behavior as what it actually is, suffering seeking relief in dysfunctional ways. And here's what changes when you see this clearly. You stop taking it personally, not as an intellectual concept, I shouldn't take this personally, but as a lived reality. You viscerally understand that their behavior isn't about you at all. You're just a person who happened to be there when their pain needed an outlet. If it wasn't you, it would be someone else. They're not targeting you because of who you are. They're acting out patterns that have nothing to do with you. And when you truly get this, when you see their behavior as their suffering rather than as your victimization, the emotional hook dissolves. The anger can't sustain itself because you're not receiving the behavior as an attack on you. You're seeing it as a symptom of their internal state. This is where compassion enters. Not as pity, not as superiority, oh, you poor damaged person, but as recognition. You recognize that you've been there. Maybe not in the exact same way, but you've experienced pain that made you act in ways you're not proud of. You've lashed out when you were hurt. You've been defensive when you were scared. You've said things you regret because you were operating from a wounded place. We all have. The person bothering you isn't some other species. They're a human being caught in suffering just like you've been caught in suffering. And that recognition creates connection instead of division. It softens the boundary between me and them. It reveals the shared humanity beneath the difficult behavior. But here's where most people get stuck with compassion. They think it means accepting the behavior, allowing it to continue, making excuses for it. That's not what I'm saying at all. You can have complete compassion for someone suffering and still set firm boundaries. You can understand that their criticism comes from their own pain and still say, I'm not available to receive criticism delivered that way. If you want to discuss concerns, we can do that respectfully, but I won't engage with attacks. You can recognize that their behavior is a symptom of their suffering and still protect yourself from it. Compassion doesn't mean letting people harm you. It means understanding why they're acting harmfully while simultaneously refusing to participate in the harm. And in fact, sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is set a boundary so clear that the person has to face the consequences of their behavior.
If you keep absorbing someone's aggression without any consequence, you're enabling that pattern. You're allowing them to continue suffering in that way. But when you say, if you speak to me like that again, I will leave this conversation, you're potentially creating an opportunity for them to recognize their pattern and choose differently. You're not punishing them. You're creating a boundary that protects both of you from being harmed and them from continuing to harm. That's compassionate action.
Here's a practice that trains this capacity. The next time someone bothers you, instead of immediately reacting with anger or defensiveness, pause and ask yourself, what pain might this person be experiencing that would cause them to behave this way? Really consider it. Get specific. Don't settle for vague answers like, they're just a jerk. Go deeper. They might be experiencing tremendous pressure at work and taking it out on people around them. They might have grown up in a family where criticism was the only form of attention, so that's all they know how to give. They might be dealing with chronic anxiety that makes them need to control situations to feel safe. You don't need to know their actual history. You're just training your mind to see behavior as an expression of internal states, rather than as a tax on you. What happens when you do this practice is remarkable. The person's behavior doesn't change. They're still being difficult, but your internal experience completely transforms. Instead of feeling attacked, you feel curious. Instead of contracting with anger, you might actually feel a wave of tenderness for how much this person must be struggling to act this way. And from that place of curiosity and tenderness, you respond entirely differently. Not with the weakness of allowing mistreatment, but with the strength of seeing clearly and acting from wisdom instead of reaction. I want to share a personal example. Years ago, I had a supervisor who was relentlessly critical. Nothing I did was ever good enough. Every piece of work came back with harsh feedback. I spent months angry, resentful, dreading our interactions. I built entire narratives about how they were trying to sabotage me, how they were threatened by me, how they were just a terrible person. And then, by chance, I learned that they were going through a brutal divorce, that they were in chronic pain from a medical condition they kept private, that they were supporting aging parents while managing financial stress I knew nothing about. Suddenly, their behavior made sense. Not that it was okay, not that I shouldn't protect myself from it, but it made sense as the behavior of someone barely holding themselves together, using control and criticism as a way to feel some sense of power when everything in their life felt out of control. That understanding didn't make me a doormat. I still set boundaries. I still addressed issues when their feedback crossed into inappropriate territory. But I did it without anger. I did it with compassion for what they were dealing with while also protecting my own well-being. And something interesting happened. They softened. When they weren't meeting my reactivity, when I wasn't feeding the adversarial dynamic with my defensive anger, there was space for a different kind of interaction. Not friendship, not closeness, but professional respect. The situation didn't become perfect, but it became manageable. And more importantly, it stopped bothering me. I could go into our meetings without the dread and resentment I'd been carrying. I could receive feedback without taking it as a personal attack. I was free, even though their behavior hadn't fundamentally changed. This is the power of compassionate seeing. It liberates you from the need for other people to change before you can be okay. You understand that they're acting from their conditioning, their pain, their limitations. And understanding this, you stop waiting for them to be different. You stop needing them to validate you, respect you, treat you the way you think they should. You see them clearly, you protect yourself appropriately, and you remain at peace regardless of how they choose to behave. But here's the deepest level of this practice. Eventually, you start to see that the same compassion you're extending to others needs to be extended to yourself. Because you're also acting from your conditioning. You're also limited by your programming. You're also suffering in ways that cause you to behave in ways you're not proud of. And when you can hold yourself with the same compassionate understanding you're learning to extend to others, something profound shifts. You stop being so hard on yourself when you react poorly. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. You recognize that you're doing the best you can with the awareness you have in each moment. And sometimes that best isn't very good. And that's okay. You're learning, you're growing, you're a work in progress, just like everyone else. This self-compassion is what allows the entire practice to deepen. Without it, extending compassion to others can become just another form of spiritual bypassing. I'll be compassionate to them and suppress my own needs and feelings. But with self-compassion, the practice becomes balanced. You hold space for others' suffering without abandoning yourself. You understand their pain without taking responsibility for it. You maintain boundaries that protect your peace while remaining open-hearted towards their struggle. The Dalai Lama has said that if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And this is exactly what he means. Compassion isn't just a nice thing you do for other people. It's a practice that fundamentally alters your relationship with difficulty. When you meet difficult behavior with compassion instead of anger, you're not giving something away, you're gaining freedom. You're gaining the ability to remain centered in the face of chaos. You're gaining the wisdom to see clearly instead of reacting blindly. You're gaining the strength that comes from understanding rather than from defensiveness. Here's what the masters of compassion understand. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Everyone is carrying pain you can't see. Everyone is doing the best they can with the tools they have, even when their best is causing harm. This isn't a justification for harmful behavior, it's a recognition of reality. And when you meet reality with compassion instead of judgment, with understanding instead of anger, you become someone who cannot be bothered. Not because you're numb, not because you don't care, but because you see so clearly that there's nothing to be bothered by. Just suffering people being suffering people, including yourself. And in that clarity, there's room for wisdom, for appropriate action, for boundaries when needed and connection when possible. But there's no room for the kind of anger that destroys your peace. That anger is dissolved by the light of compassionate understanding. And what remains is an unshakable equanimity that allows you to move through the world responding to what's needed, undisturbed by what's not, free at last from the prison of perpetual reactivity.
Chapter 7. The Alchemy of Response versus Reaction. There's a moment between what happens to you and what you do about it. Most people live their entire lives never noticing this moment exists. They experience something triggering, a criticism, an insult, a dismissal, and instantly they're reacting. Words are flying out of their mouth, actions are happening, emotions are flooding their system, and it all feels completely automatic, completely beyond their control. But here's the truth that changes everything. Nothing is automatic. There's always a gap. There's always a moment of choice. You've just been moving through it so fast, so unconsciously, that you never saw it was there. And learning to inhabit that gap, learning to pause in that space between stimulus and response, is the difference between being a puppet controlled by circumstances and being a master of your own experience. Let me be precise about what I mean by reaction versus response. A reaction is automatic. It's unconscious. It's driven by conditioning, by habit, by the primitive parts of your brain that are designed to keep you safe from physical threats. When someone insults you and you immediately insult them back, that's a reaction. Your amygdala detected a threat to your ego, flooded your system with stress hormones, and triggered an automatic defense program. You didn't choose it, it chose you. A response, on the other hand, is conscious. It's deliberate. It's the result of that gap, that pause, where you take in what's happening, you consider your options, and you choose the action that aligns with your values and your long-term well-being rather than your immediate impulse. Here's why this distinction matters so much. Reactions almost always make things worse. They escalate conflicts. They damage relationships. They create consequences you didn't intend and don't want. Think about the last time you reacted in anger to something someone said. Maybe you said something cruel, maybe you sent an email you immediately regretted, maybe you slammed the door or made a scene. And then what happened? Did it improve the situation? Did it make you feel better in any lasting way? Almost certainly not. You probably felt a momentary release of tension, followed by regret,
shame, or the realization that you've now created a bigger problem than the one you started with. Reactions are almost always about discharging tension, not about solving problems. They're emotional vomit. You feel sick with anger or hurt, and you expel it onto whoever's nearby. And like actual vomit, it doesn't feel good afterward, and it definitely doesn't feel good for anyone who got hit by it. Responses, on the other hand, can actually improve situations. A response might be setting a clear boundary. I'm not willing to be spoken to that way. I need you to lower your voice. A response might be asking a clarifying question. When you said that, did you mean X or Y? I want to make sure I understand. A response might be acknowledging your own part. You're right that I dropped the ball on that. Let me fix it. A response might be choosing to disengage entirely. I can see we're both too heated to have this conversation productively right now. Let's revisit this tomorrow. None of these are reactions. They're all conscious choices made from a place of clarity about what will actually serve the situation rather than just discharge your discomfort. But here's what makes the gap between stimulus and response so challenging to access. You have to go against millions of years of evolutionary programming. Your brain is wired to react instantly to threats. In the environment where humans evolved, the person who paused to consider their options when facing a predator was the person who got eaten. The person who immediately ran survived. So your brain developed this incredibly fast threat detection and response system that bypasses your conscious, rational mind entirely. It's designed to save your life by triggering automatic reactions before you have time to think. And that system is still operating in you right now, in an environment where most of the threats you face are social, not physical. Your brain can't tell the difference between a lion and a rude comment. Both trigger the same emergency response system. This is why pausing feels so unnatural at first, so almost impossible. Every fiber of your being is screaming at you to react, to defend, to fight back, to make the bad feelings stop right now. Your heart is racing, your muscles are tense, stress hormones are flooding your system, and it all feels completely automatic, completely beyond your control. And in that state, pausing feels like weakness, like letting yourself be a victim, like swallowing your power. But it's actually the opposite. Pausing is the most powerful thing you can do, because in that pause, you reclaim control from your automatic programming. You create space for wisdom instead of just for instinct.
Here's a practice that will train this capacity more effectively than anything else I can give you. For the next 2 weeks, every time you feel the impulse to react to something someone has said or done, commit to a 5-second pause before you do anything. 5 seconds. Count them slowly in your head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. During those 5 seconds, you're not deciding what to say or planning your response. You're just breathing and observing what's happening in your body. You're feeling the heat, the tension, the urgency. You're noticing the thoughts racing through your mind. You're watching the whole reaction machinery activate. And then after 5 seconds, you respond. Not react, respond. You choose what to say or do from a place of slightly more calm, slightly more perspective. At first, 5 seconds will feel like an eternity. The impulse to speak immediately will be almost overwhelming. You'll feel like you're being too slow, like the moment is passing, like you need to jump in right now or lose your chance. But push through that feeling. Actually count the 5 seconds. What you'll discover is that 5 seconds is plenty of time to shift from reaction to response. 5 seconds is enough for the initial surge of adrenaline to begin settling. 5 seconds is enough for your prefrontal cortex, your rational, wise brain, to come back online. 5 seconds is enough to break the automatic pattern and create the possibility of choosing differently. And here's what's remarkable. Most of the time, after 5 seconds, you won't even want to say what you were about to say. The thing that felt absolutely necessary to express in the heat of the moment will reveal itself as petty, as unhelpful, as just your ego trying to defend itself. You'll realize that responding in kind to rudeness just perpetuates rudeness. You'll see that defending yourself against criticism with aggression only makes you look defensive. You'll understand that the most powerful thing you can do is often to not take the bait at all, to let the provocation pass without engaging it. And that realization only becomes available in the pause.
Without the pause, you're just a machine running its programming. Let me show you what this looks like in practice with a specific example. You're in a meeting and a colleague undermines your idea in front of everyone. In the old pattern, the reaction would be instant. You'd feel a flash of anger and humiliation, and you'd either attack back. Actually, if you understood the data, you'd see why that makes sense. Or you'd shut down and stew in resentment for the rest of the meeting. Both reactions, both automatic, both unhelpful. But with the pause, something different becomes possible. You feel the flash of anger and humiliation. You notice it. You count 5 seconds while breathing, and in those 5 seconds, you gain just enough perspective to see options. You could address it directly, but without aggression. I'm interested in understanding your concern. Can you be more specific about what you think won't work? You could acknowledge their point if it has merit. That's a good consideration. Let me think about how to address that. You could even choose to let it go in the moment and address it privately later if needed. Any of these could be the right response depending on the situation. The point is that you're choosing consciously instead of reacting unconsciously. This practice of pausing also reveals something crucial about the nature of anger itself. Most of it is optional. When you pause and observe, you realize that the anger isn't being forced on you by external circumstances. It's arising in you as one possible response, and you're choosing, often unconsciously, to feed it and act on it. But you could choose differently. You could choose curiosity instead of anger. You could choose compassion instead of defensiveness. You could choose humor instead of hostility. The external trigger doesn't determine your internal response. Your interpretation and your choice determine your response. And the pause is what creates the space for those choices to become visible. But here's what you need to understand about building this capacity. It's a muscle. It gets stronger with practice. The first 100 times you try to pause, you'll fail 90 times. You'll react before you remember to pause. You'll remember to pause, but won't be able to sustain it for 5 seconds. You'll pause, but the pull toward reaction will be so strong that you do it anyway. That's not failure. That's training. Every single time you remember to pause, even if you then react anyway, you're strengthening the neural pathway that creates the gap between stimulus and response. You're teaching your brain that there's an alternative to automatic reaction. And slowly, over weeks and months of practice, the pause becomes more natural. The gap becomes wider. The responses become more consistent, and the reactions become less frequent. The masters of this practice develop what looks like superhuman patience to outside observers. You can provoke them, insult them, try every manipulation tactic you know, and they just respond with calm clarity. Not because they're suppressing their reactions, they've transcended the need to react. They've trained themselves to such a degree that the pause is their default state. They don't experience the urgent pull toward immediate reaction that most people do. They're just naturally living in the gap, assessing situations clearly and choosing responses that align with their values and objectives. And that looks like power. That looks like mastery, because it is. Here's what you need to know about the relationship between this practice and the other practices we've covered. They all work together. The witness consciousness we talked about earlier, that's what allows you to observe the reaction impulse without being swept away by it. The compassion we discussed, that's what softens the need to defend and attack, making the pause easier to sustain. The understanding that your stories aren't reality, that's what prevents you from getting so locked into interpretations that reaction feels like the only option. These aren't separate practices, they're different aspects of the same fundamental transformation, moving from unconscious reactivity to conscious response, from being controlled by circumstances to being the author of your experience. And here's the promise. When you master this, when the pause becomes natural and response becomes your default instead of reaction, you'll find that most of what used to bother you simply stops bothering you. Not because you've built walls or suppressed your feelings, but because you've changed your relationship with difficulty. You're no longer in a constant state of defensive vigilance, ready to react to any perceived slight or threat. You're relaxed. You're open. You're confident in your ability to respond to whatever arises. And that confidence, that groundedness, changes how people interact with you. They're not likely to provoke you because there's nothing to provoke. They're not likely to test you because you're clearly not reactive. And on the rare occasions when someone does try to bother you, You respond with such clear calm that it dissolves the situation instead of escalating it. This is what it means to be truly unbotherable. Not numb, not disconnected, not pretending everything is fine, but genuinely unmoved by the provocations and difficulties that used to derail your entire day. You're present, you're engaged, you're responsive, but you're no longer reactive. And in that transformation lies a freedom that most people never experience, the freedom to move through the world as a conscious creator of your responses rather than as an unconscious victim of your reactions. That freedom is available to you right now. It starts with 5 seconds. It starts with the next time something bothers you. Will you pause? Will you create the gap? Will you choose response over reaction? That choice is yours. It's always been yours. You're just starting to see it now.
Let me tell you about the most misunderstood aspect of never being bothered by anyone: boundaries. Most people think that if you're truly at peace, truly evolved, truly practicing non-reactivity, you shouldn't need boundaries. You should just be able to accept whatever comes your way with serene detachment. That's not wisdom. That's spiritual bypassing at its worst. Real mastery includes the ability to set clear, firm boundaries without anger, without guilt, and without needing the other person to understand or agree. In fact, I'll go further. If you can't set boundaries, you haven't transcended anger. You've just learned to suppress it while letting people harm you. And that's not freedom. That's a different kind of prison. Here's what a boundary actually is. It's a clear statement of what you will and won't accept in your life, backed up by consistent action. It's not about controlling other people's behavior. You can't do that. It's about deciding what you'll expose yourself to and what you'll remove yourself from. It's about taking responsibility for protecting your own peace, your own energy, your own well-being, instead of waiting for other people to magically become considerate. Boundaries are not walls. Walls keep everything out, good and bad, leaving you isolated and defended. Boundaries are more like the fence around a garden. They create a protected space where beautiful things can grow, while keeping out the things that would destroy what you're cultivating. Most people struggle with boundaries because they've absorbed toxic beliefs about what boundaries mean. If I set a boundary, I'm being mean. If I say no, people won't like me. If I protect myself, I'm being selfish. If I'm truly compassionate, I should accept whatever people do to me. These beliefs keep you trapped in perpetual violation, constantly bothered by people who cross lines you never clearly drew. And then you wonder why you're always angry, always resentful, always feeling drained by your relationships. It's because you're expecting people to intuitively know and respect limits you've never actually communicated. You're expecting them to care about your well-being more than you do. And when they don't, you blame them. But the responsibility is yours. Here's the fundamental principle. You teach people how to treat you, not through what you say, but through what you tolerate. Every time someone crosses a line and you don't address it, you're teaching them that crossing that line is acceptable. Every time someone speaks to you disrespectfully and you engage as if everything is fine, you're teaching them that disrespect works with you. Every time someone takes advantage of your generosity and you keep giving, you're teaching them that there are no consequences for taking advantage. This isn't their fault. They're just responding to the feedback you're giving them through your actions. And the feedback you've been giving them is that your boundaries are negotiable, that your needs don't matter as much as keeping the peace, that you'll absorb mistreatment to avoid confrontation. But here's what changes when you start setting clear boundaries. You stop being bothered by people because you stop allowing the situations that bother you. Someone speaks to you rudely? You don't react with anger. You respond with a boundary. I'm not continuing this conversation while you're raising your voice. When you're ready to speak calmly, I'm here to listen. And then you follow through. If they keep yelling, you leave. You don't argue about it. You don't explain it to death. You simply enforce your boundary through action. Someone consistently shows up late and disrespects your time? You don't lecture them about responsibility. You set a boundary.
I wait 5 minutes. After that, I leave. And then you do it. Someone keeps asking you to do things you don't have time or energy for. You don't make excuses or over-explain. You simply say, that doesn't work for me, or I'm not available for that. Notice what's not present in any of these boundaries. Anger. You're not setting boundaries because you're angry at the person. You're setting them because you're clear about what you need to maintain your peace and well-being. Anger is what happens when you don't set boundaries, when you keep absorbing behavior you're not okay with until you finally explode. Boundaries prevent that explosion. They're a form of self-care and self-respect that actually makes it easier to remain compassionate towards others because you're not silently accumulating resentment while pretending everything is fine. Here's what most people discover when they start setting boundaries. There's resistance, both internal and external. Internally, you'll feel guilt. You'll hear voices in your head saying, "Who do you think you are? You're being too demanding. You're going to hurt their feelings. They're going to reject you." These are the voices of your conditioning, the programming that taught you that your needs don't matter as much as other people's comfort. And you have to push through those voices. You have to recognize that setting a boundary is not cruel. Allowing someone to continue treating you poorly is cruel to both of you. Externally, people who are used to crossing your boundaries will push back. They'll tell you you're being unreasonable, too sensitive, difficult. They might even escalate their behavior to test whether you really mean it. This is normal. This is them adjusting to a new reality where your boundaries actually matter. And this is where most people cave. Right at the point of resistance, they back down, apologize, let the boundary collapse. And in doing so, they teach the person that pushing back works, that your boundaries are optional. You have to hold the line. Not with anger, not with righteousness, not with long explanations about why you deserve to be treated well, just with calm, consistent enforcement. If someone violates a boundary you've set, you follow through with the consequence you stated. Every time, without exception. This is how people learn that your boundaries are real, not through your words, but through your actions. And here's what's interesting. When you consistently enforce boundaries without anger or drama, most people adjust. They might not like it at first. They might complain, but they adjust because they realize that the old dynamic isn't available anymore. And often, the relationship actually improves because there's now clarity instead of hidden resentment.
But some people won't adjust. Some people are so invested in being able to cross your boundaries that they'll choose to leave your life rather than respect them. And this is where you have to make a choice. Do you want this person in your life enough to abandon yourself? Do you want to continue sacrificing your peace to maintain a relationship with someone who refuses to treat you with basic respect? For most people, the answer is no, but they've never clearly posed the question to themselves. They've just been tolerating mistreatment on autopilot, never stopping to consider whether this is actually a relationship worth having. Here's a practice that will clarify your boundaries and make them easier to enforce. Take an inventory of your life and identify the top 5 situations or behaviors that consistently bother you. Be specific, not people being rude, that's too vague. Something like, my mother criticizing my parenting in front of my children. My boss calling me after work hours for non-emergencies. My friend constantly canceling plans at the last minute. Once you've identified these 5 situations, write out a clear boundary for each one. What are you no longer willing to tolerate? What will you do if this behavior happens again? And then, this is crucial, communicate those boundaries clearly to the people involved and follow through the next time the situation arises. Let me give you an example from my own life. I had a friend who would constantly unload all their problems on me, but never had time to listen when I was struggling. Every conversation was about their drama, their needs, their crises. And I kept accepting it because I valued the friendship and didn't want to seem unsupportive. But I was building massive resentment. Finally, I set a boundary. I said, I care about you and I want to support you, but I need our friendship to be more balanced. I need to feel like you're as interested in my life as I am in yours. So moving forward, I'd like us to both share what's going on, not just one of us. They initially resisted. I thought you were okay with listening. I didn't know this was a problem.
and I calmly held the boundary. I should have said something sooner, but I'm saying it now. This is what I need from the friendship. In the following weeks, they tested it. They'd call with a crisis and expect me to drop everything like I always had, and I didn't. I said, I have 15 minutes right now. Let's talk for 15 minutes, and then we can schedule a longer conversation later this week. Some days they respected it. Some days they got frustrated and hung up. But over time, the friendship either needed to change or end. It changed. They learned that I was serious about the boundary and they adjusted. And our friendship is actually deeper now because it's not built on me abandoning myself to take care of them. But here's what you need to understand. Not all boundaries need to be communicated verbally. Some boundaries are simply about what you will and won't do. You don't need to announce, I've decided I'm no longer going to check work email after 7 p.m. You just stop doing it. If someone asks why you didn't respond to their late-night email, you can say, I don't check email in the evenings. No apology, no long explanation, just a clear statement of your practice. You don't need to sit your family down and announce, I will no longer be attending events where I'm consistently insulted. You just stop attending. If they ask why, you can say, I'm not comfortable with how those gatherings usually go. I'm choosing to spend my time differently. The boundary is in the action. This is especially important for dealing with people who argue with your boundaries. Some people, when you set a boundary, will try to debate you into abandoning it. But why can't you just blah? That's ridiculous. Everyone else is fine with blah. You're being too sensitive about blah. And if you engage in the debate, you've already lost. Because you're treating your boundary like it's up for negotiation, like they get a vote in what you need. They don't. You don't need anyone's permission to protect your peace. You don't need anyone to understand or agree with your boundaries for them to be valid. So when someone tries to argue with your boundary, the response is simple. I understand you don't agree. This is still my boundary. And then you stop engaging. You don't defend, you don't justify, you don't explain. You just restate and enforce. The masters of boundaries have a quality that's unmistakable. They're relaxed. They're not braced for attack, not constantly vigilant, not walking on eggshells around difficult people, because they know that if someone crosses a line, they'll handle it. They don't need to prevent bad behavior from happening. They just need to respond to it clearly when it does. And that confidence changes everything. It changes how they show up in relationships. It changes how people interact with them. It changes their entire experience of navigating the world. They're not bothered by people because they've created a life where boundary violations are rare, and when they happen, they're addressed immediately instead of being accumulated and resented. Here's what I want you to understand before we move forward. Boundaries are an expression of self-love. They're you saying, I matter, my peace matters, my well-being matters, and I'm willing to protect those things even if it makes other people uncomfortable. That's not selfishness, that's self-respect. And you cannot truly love others from a place of wholeness if you're constantly violating yourself to accommodate them. The compassion we talked about earlier, it's only sustainable when it's paired with boundaries. Otherwise, it's just self-abandonment disguised as spirituality. You can be compassionate towards someone suffering and still refuse to let them dump that suffering on you. You can understand why someone behaves poorly and still remove yourself from their behavior. Compassion and boundaries aren't opposites, they're partners. Together, they create the possibility of being in relationship with difficult people without being destroyed by them. And that's freedom. That's what it means to be truly unbotherable. Not because nothing challenging happens, but because you've created sacred territory around your peace and you protect it fiercely, lovingly, without apology.
Chapter 9. The Reconstruction of Identity. There's a version of your identity that's been holding you hostage your entire life, and you've never questioned it. This identity says, I am the kind of person who gets angry when disrespected. I am someone who can't tolerate certain behaviors. I am someone who needs to defend myself, prove myself, maintain my reputation. You've been living inside the story about who you are for so long that you think it's actually you, but it's not.
It's just a pattern of thoughts you've repeated so many times that they've calcified into what feels like a fixed identity. And here's the truth that will set you free. You can rewrite this identity completely. You can become someone fundamentally different. Not through willpower, not through suppression, but through consciously reconstructing who you understand yourself to be. Let me show you how deep this goes. Right now, if I asked you to describe yourself, you'd probably give me a list of characteristics. I'm introverted, I'm analytical, I'm someone who values respect, I'm quick-tempered, I'm loyal, I'm sensitive to criticism. And you'd believe that these characteristics are just observations of who you are, neutral facts about your nature, but they're not. They're stories you've told yourself, interpretations of your patterns, and most importantly, they're self-fulfilling prophecies. Because the moment you identify as someone who's quick-tempered, you've created a framework that makes quick temper inevitable. Your brain says, well, this is who I am, so when someone provokes me, getting angry is just me being authentic to my nature. You've given yourself permission to keep acting out that pattern because you've labeled it as identity rather than as choice. This is what psychologists call self-schema, and it's one of the most powerful forces shaping your behavior. Your self-schema is your organized collection of beliefs about yourself, and it acts as a filter for all incoming information. When something happens that confirms your self-schema, you notice it and file it away as evidence. See, there I go again, being quick-tempered. That's just who I am. When something happens that contradicts your self-schema, like a time when you stayed calm in a provoking situation, you tend to dismiss it as an anomaly. Well, that was unusual. I must have been in a good mood. Your brain is constantly working to maintain consistency with your self-concept, even when that self-concept is limiting you, even when it's causing you suffering. But here's the revolutionary insight. This self-schema isn't fixed. It's not hardwired. It's not your destiny. It's just a habit of thought. And habits can be changed. You can deliberately construct a new identity, a new story about who you are, and your brain will begin to filter reality through that new lens instead. This isn't positive thinking. This isn't affirmations in the mirror. This is something much deeper. It's consciously choosing the identity you're going to inhabit and then reinforcing that identity through both thought and action until it becomes as automatic as the old identity was. Here's how this works in practice. Right now, you probably identify as someone who gets bothered by certain things. That's your self-schema. And as long as that's your identity, you'll keep getting bothered because getting bothered is what someone with that identity does. But what if you began to identify as someone who remains calm regardless of external circumstances? Not as a goal, not as something you're trying to become, but as who you already are. What if you started thinking of yourself that way, referring to yourself that way, making decisions based on that identity? Your brain would start looking for evidence to support this new self-schema. It would notice the times you stayed calm. It would interpret ambiguous situations through the lens of, I'm someone who doesn't get rattled. And gradually, your behavior would align with this new identity because you're reinforcing it constantly. This isn't fake it until you make it. This is something more subtle and more powerful. It's recognizing that identity is always constructed, always a story, and you get to choose which story you're going to tell. The old identity, I'm quick-tempered, I'm sensitive, I get angry easily, that was chosen too. Maybe not consciously. Maybe it was given to you by your family. Oh, that's just how they are. They've always had a temper. Maybe you constructed it from your experiences. People have treated me poorly, so of course I'm defensive. But either way, it was a choice. And if one identity can be chosen, a different one can be chosen too. Let me give you a specific practice for reconstructing identity. First, identify the current identity that's creating the pattern you want to change. Write it down exactly as you think about it. I am someone who. Be honest. Don't write who you wish you were. Write who you currently believe you are in relation to anger and being bothered. Maybe it's, I am someone who can't tolerate disrespect, or I am someone who gets hurt easily, or I am someone who needs to defend myself when challenged.
Whatever it is, make it explicit. Now here's the crucial step. Write out your new identity, not as a future goal, but as a present reality. I am someone who remains centered regardless of how others behave. I am someone who sees difficulty as information rather than as attack. I am someone who doesn't need to defend or prove anything. Write this new identity statement in the present tense, as if it's already true. Because here's the secret. It is already true. It's not something you need to become, it's something you need to recognize. The calm, centered, unbotherable version of you already exists. It's the awareness we talked about earlier. It's your true nature beneath the conditioned reactions. You're not creating something new, you're uncovering what's already there. Once you have this new identity statement, you need to reinforce it constantly, not through mindless repetition, but through deliberate practice. Every morning, before you start your day, say your new identity statement and visualize yourself embodying it. See yourself in situations that would normally trigger you, and see yourself responding from this new identity. See yourself staying calm when someone is rude. See yourself unbothered when someone criticizes you. See yourself responding with wisdom instead of reacting with anger. This isn't fantasy. This is rehearsal. You're training your brain to recognize this new identity as reality.
Then, throughout your day, look for evidence that supports your new identity. This is crucial because your brain is going to keep trying to find evidence for the old identity. That's what it's been trained to do for years. So you have to actively intervene and redirect its attention. When you handle a difficult situation calmly, don't dismiss it. Stop and acknowledge it. That's who I am. I'm someone who stays centered. When you notice yourself about to react and you pause instead, celebrate it. There I am, being someone who chooses response over reaction. You're retraining your brain's pattern recognition system to notice and reinforce your new identity instead of your old one. And here's what happens when you do this consistently. Over time, the new identity stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like reality. The calm response stops feeling like effort and starts feeling natural. The moments of being unbothered stop being exceptions and start being your baseline. You've literally reconstructed who you are. Not through force, not through suppression of your old patterns, but through conscious redirection of your attention and your self-concept. But I need to warn you about something. There will be people in your life who are invested in your old identity. They're used to you being reactive, being bothered, being predictable in your patterns. And when you start showing up differently, when you don't react the way you used to, it's going to confuse them. Some of them might even try to pull you back into the old pattern. They'll push your old buttons harder because those buttons used to work, and they don't understand why they're not working anymore. This is a test. This is where you prove to yourself and to them that your new identity is real. Don't announce it. Don't explain that you're working on yourself or trying to be calmer. Just be it. Let your actions demonstrate the change. And when people comment on it, wow, you didn't even react to that. That's not like you. Simply respond, actually, it is like me. Because it is. It's the real you. The you beneath the conditioned patterns. Here's a deeper layer to this reconstruction. You need to examine the beliefs that supported your old identity and consciously replace them with beliefs that support your new identity. Your old identity of being quick-tempered was built on beliefs like, if I don't defend myself, people will walk all over me, or anger is the only way to make people take me seriously, or I need to prove my worth by not accepting disrespect. These beliefs made sense within that identity framework, but they're not universal truths. They're just beliefs, and you can replace them with different beliefs. My peace is more valuable than proving anything to anyone. People respect clarity and calmness more than they respect anger. My worth is inherent and doesn't need to be defended. These new beliefs support your new identity. They make being unbotherable logical instead of making reactivity logical. The work here is to catch yourself operating from old beliefs and consciously substitute new ones.
when you feel the impulse to defend yourself because, if I don't, they'll think they can disrespect me. Stop and ask, is that true? Or is that an old belief supporting an old identity? Then substitute the new belief. My peace is worth more than managing their opinion of me. It feels awkward at first. It feels like you're lying to yourself. But you're not lying. You're just choosing a different truth to operate from. Both beliefs are interpretations. Neither is objectively true. You're simply choosing the interpretation that serves your well-being instead of the interpretation that creates suffering. Let me share something from my own journey with this. I spent decades identified as someone who doesn't tolerate fools. That was my story about myself. I was proud of it, in a way. It felt like integrity, like having standards. But what it actually meant was that I was constantly angry at people who I deemed foolish, which was a lot of people. I was perpetually irritated, perpetually bothered, perpetually defending my intellectual territory. And I thought that was just who I was, someone with high standards and low tolerance. Then I realized, this identity is making me miserable. Is it even serving me? The answer was no. So I consciously chose a new identity. I am someone who meets people where they are without needing them to be different. That felt almost impossible at first. It felt like I was abandoning my standards. But I practiced it. I reinforced it. I looked for evidence of it. And over months, something shifted. I stopped being bothered by behavior that used to enrage me. Not because I lowered my standards, but because I stopped needing everyone to meet them. My new identity made that possible. My old identity made it impossible.
Here's what the masters of this practice understand. Identity is fluid. You are not a fixed entity. You are a process, constantly changing, constantly evolving. The question isn't who am I in some permanent, essential sense. The question is, who am I choosing to be right now? And the answer to that question is demonstrated not by your words, but by your responses to difficulty. When someone provokes you, who shows up? The old identity or the new one? The reactive pattern or the centered presence? And here's the beautiful thing. Every single time you choose to respond from your new identity instead of reacting from your old one, you're strengthening the new neural pathways and weakening the old ones. You're literally rewiring your brain to make your new identity the default. This is not about perfection. You're gonna backslide. You're gonna have moments where the old pattern emerges and you react exactly like the old identity would. That's not failure. That's information. It shows you that there's still some residual energy in that old pattern, still some belief or trigger that needs attention. So you examine it without judgment. You ask, what belief was I operating from in that moment? What part of the old identity still has a grip? And then you consciously recommit to the new identity, not with shame, not with self-criticism, but with clarity and recommitment. What you're doing through this practice is claiming authorship of your own life. For your entire life up until now, you've been living an identity that was largely given to you by your family, by your experiences, by your conditioning. You've been on autopilot, running patterns without questioning whether they serve you. But now you're waking up. You're recognizing that identity is a choice, and you're making a different choice. You're choosing to be someone who cannot be bothered, not because nothing affects you, but because you've constructed an identity that processes difficulty differently. You've become someone who sees challenges as opportunities to demonstrate your centeredness rather than as threats to defend against. You've become someone who knows that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, so there's nothing to prove and nothing to protect. You've become someone who is so grounded in who they are that external chaos cannot shake your foundation. That's not who you're trying to become. That's who you're recognizing you already are beneath the old patterns. That's the reconstruction. That's the revolution. And it starts right now with a single choice. Who are you going to be the next time someone tries to bother you?
Chapter 10. Integration and the Path Forward. You've traveled a long distance from where we began.
You started this journey probably believing that other people had the power to make you angry, that your emotional state was at the mercy of how people chose to treat you, that being bothered was an inevitable response to difficult behavior. But now you know better. You know that anger is created internally through interpretation. You know that there's a gap between stimulus and response where all your power lives. You know that you are not your reactions, not your thoughts, not even your identity. You are the awareness witnessing all of it. You know that compassion and boundaries together create the possibility of remaining open-hearted without being destroyed. And you know that identity is constructed, which means it can be reconstructed. This knowledge changes everything. But knowledge alone isn't transformation. Transformation happens in the integration, in the daily practice of living from these principles until they become so natural that you forget you ever lived any other way. Let me be honest with you about what the path forward looks like. This isn't a linear journey where you learn these principles, apply them once, and suddenly you're permanently unbotherable. This is a practice that deepens over time, that reveals new layers as you grow, that requires constant recommitment even when you think you've mastered it. You're going to have days where you handle difficulty with such grace that you barely recognize yourself. And you're going to have days where you react exactly like the old version of you, where you get completely swept away by anger or hurt or defensiveness, and you'll wonder if you've learned anything at all. Both of these experiences are part of the process. This is not about perfection, this is about direction. It's about the overall trajectory of your growth, not about never making mistakes. Here's what integration actually looks like in practice. You wake up in the morning and you set your intention for the day. Not a vague intention like be better, but a specific one based on what you've learned. Today, I am someone who remains centered regardless of external circumstances. When difficulty arises, I will pause before responding. I will meet others' pain with compassion instead of reactivity. I will protect my peace through clear boundaries. You spend 2 minutes visualizing yourself embodying these principles in situations that typically trigger you. You're not hoping these situations won't arise, you're preparing to meet them differently when they do. Then you move through your day and inevitably someone does something that triggers you. Maybe it's small, someone cuts you off in traffic. Maybe it's significant, someone undermines you in a meeting. In that moment, all your conditioning is screaming at you to react. Your body is flooded with stress hormones. Your mind is generating urgent thoughts about why you need to respond immediately. And this is the moment where everything you've learned either becomes lived wisdom or remains theoretical knowledge. This is where you make the choice. Am I going to react from the old pattern, or am I going to respond from my new understanding? Let's say you catch yourself. You notice the reaction forming, you pause, you breathe. You observe the sensations in your body without feeding them with story. You recognize that this person's behavior is about their pain, not your worth. You set a boundary if needed, or you let it go if it's not worth your energy. You respond from clarity instead of reacting from compulsion. And afterward, you don't just move on. You take a moment to acknowledge what just happened. I did that. I caught the pattern. I chose differently. This is who I'm becoming. That acknowledgement is crucial. Your brain needs to register that success. It needs to file that experience as evidence of your new identity. Without that conscious acknowledgement, your brain might dismiss it as an exception instead of recognizing it as your new normal. But let's also say there are times when you don't catch yourself. The trigger happens, and you react before you remember to pause. You say something you regret. You escalate a conflict. You get swept away by anger. What then? This is where most people give up. They think, I've failed. I'm not actually changing. This is just who I am. But that's the old identity reasserting itself. The new approach is different. You notice what happened without self-judgment. I reacted from the old pattern. That shows me there's still charge there, still some unprocessed material. Then you examine it with curiosity instead of shame. What was I believing in that moment that made reactivity feel necessary? What old identity or fear was active? And then you consciously recommit. Next time this situation arises, I will remember to pause. I will respond from my new identity instead of reacting from the old pattern. This is the practice of integration. Not perfection, but conscious learning from every experience, both the successes and the failures. Every situation where you get triggered is an opportunity to see where the old patterns still have energy, where your understanding is still theoretical instead of embodied, where you need to go deeper. The goal is not to reach a state where nothing triggers you. The goal is to shorten the time between trigger and recognition, between reaction and recommitment. Maybe right now you react, and it takes you 3 hours to realize you reacted and recommitted. With consistent practice, maybe it takes you 30 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 2 minutes. Eventually, you catch yourself mid-reaction and can course correct in real time. And ultimately, you catch yourself before the reaction even fully forms. That's the arc of mastery. Here's a practice for ongoing integration that I want you to implement starting today. At the end of each day, spend 5 minutes in reflection. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, where did I get triggered today? Be specific. Not, I got angry, but I got angry when my partner made that comment about my work. Second, how did I respond? Did I react automatically, or did I pause and choose my response? Be honest without judgment. And third, what did I learn? What does this experience show me about where I still need to grow, or what does it confirm about how I'm changing? Write down your answers if you can. This daily reflection turns every experience into education. It prevents you from moving through life on autopilot. It keeps you conscious of your patterns and your growth.
But integration isn't just about handling difficulty when it arises. It's also about creating a life that minimizes unnecessary difficulty. This is where boundaries come back in. As you practice these principles, you'll start to notice that certain relationships, certain environments, certain situations are perpetually triggering. And you have a choice. You can keep exposing yourself to those situations and using them as practice, or you can recognize that part of wisdom is removing yourself from unnecessary suffering. Not everything needs to be endured. Not every difficult person needs to remain in your life. Not every toxic environment needs to be tolerated while you practice remaining calm within it. There's a balance here that you need to find for yourself. On one hand, you don't want to run away from every difficulty, creating a sanitized life where you're never challenged. That's not growth. That's avoidance. Challenge is how you develop capacity. On the other hand, you don't need to keep subjecting yourself to truly toxic situations just to prove you can handle them. There's no spiritual prize for enduring unnecessary harm. So the question becomes, is this difficulty serving my growth, or is it just depleting me? Is this relationship teaching me something, or is it just draining my energy? Is this situation worth the effort to remain centered within it, or is it time to remove myself? Only you can answer these questions for your specific circumstances. But part of integration is developing the wisdom to know the difference between the difficulty that grows you and the difficulty that just damages you, and having the courage to walk away from the latter while staying present with the former. This discernment is itself a skill that develops over time. At first, you might not be able to tell the difference. Everything difficult might feel like it's too much. But as you grow, as you develop genuine capacity to remain centered in challenging situations, you'll start to recognize the difference between this is hard and I'm being stretched, and this is toxic and I'm being depleted. Here's what I've learned from my own practice and from watching others walk this path. The transformation is gradual, and then it's sudden. For a long time, it feels like you're making small progress. You catch yourself a little more often, you pause a little more consistently, you recover from reactivity a little faster. It's incremental, it's effortful. You're conscious of the practice constantly. And then, one day, you realize something has fundamentally shifted. Someone does something that used to absolutely destroy your peace, and you notice that you're just fine. Not fine because you're suppressing your reaction, fine because there's no reaction to suppress. The behavior just doesn't land the way it used to. It doesn't create the internal disturbance. You've reached a level of integration where the practice has become your nature. And that moment is stunning. It's the moment you realize you're actually free. But here's what happens after that moment of realization. You encounter a new level of difficulty that reveals a deeper layer of work. This is the infinite nature of this practice. You don't complete it.
You don't reach some final state of perfection where nothing ever bothers you again. What happens is that your capacity keeps expanding. Things that would have destroyed you last year barely register now. But new challenges emerge that reveal new edges of growth. Maybe you've mastered not being bothered by strangers' rudeness, but you're still triggered by your family. Maybe you've transcended being bothered by criticism at work, but intimate relationships still activate old wounds. This is good news, not bad news. It means you're growing. It means there's always a new frontier of freedom available to you. The masters of this practice understand that it's not about reaching some elevated state where you're above it all. It's about developing such a deep relationship with your own awareness that you can meet whatever arises with clarity and compassion. It's about building such trust in your capacity to handle difficulty that you stop fearing it. It's about recognizing that you are not diminished by other people's behavior, that your worth is not determined by their treatment, that your peace is not dependent on their choices. And from that recognition, you become truly free. Not free from challenge, but free within it. Here's my invitation to you as you move forward from here. Commit to this practice for the next 90 days. 90 days of conscious application of everything you've learned. Every morning, set your intention. Every difficult encounter, practice pausing and responding instead of reacting. Every evening, reflect on what you learned. 90 days is enough time to build new neural pathways, to start shifting your default patterns, to see genuine transformation in how you relate to difficulty. And at the end of those 90 days, you'll have evidence. Not theoretical knowledge, but lived experience of who you're becoming. And beyond those 90 days, you keep going. Because this practice isn't a destination you reach, it's a way of being you inhabit. It's how you move through the world. It's who you're becoming, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. You're becoming someone who cannot be bothered. Not because you're numb or detached, not because you've built impenetrable walls, but because you found the unshakable ground of your own being. You've discovered that beneath all the reactions, beneath all the stories, beneath all the conditioned patterns, there's an awareness that's never been disturbed by anything. And you've learned to rest there, to live from there, to respond from there. That awareness is who you actually are. Everything else, the anger, the hurt, the defensiveness, the need to prove and protect, that's just weather passing through. And you're learning to be the sky instead of the storm. The sky doesn't fight the storm. It doesn't suppress the storm. It doesn't pretend the storm isn't there. It simply holds the storm within its vast spaciousness. And the storm, no matter how intense, eventually passes. This is your nature. This is what you're returning to. And every time you pause instead of reacting, every time you respond with wisdom instead of with reactivity, every time you remain centered when someone tries to shake you, you're not becoming someone new. You're remembering who you've always been beneath the conditioning. So move forward from here with clarity and commitment. You know what to do. You know who you are. And you know that the person who bothers you most is the one who exists only when you forget these truths. Remember them. Live them. Become them. And watch as the world that once seemed full of people determined to destroy your peace reveals itself as simply full of people struggling with their own pain. None of them with any power over you that you don't give them. That's the final truth. That's the freedom. That's the life that's waiting for you on the other side of this practice. A life where you're genuinely, deeply, permanently unbotherable. Not because nothing difficult happens, but because you've become someone who meets difficulty with such clarity that it can't shake who you know yourself to be. That person is already here. They've been here all along. This entire journey has just been about clearing away everything that was obscuring them. And now they're emerging. Now you're becoming who you've always been. And that is the most beautiful transformation of all.